Hi, good evening. It is Sunday, January 24th, and it is cold and windy and blustery outside, but we have a happy hour to read, and today we're reading Chapter 17, Lobstering in the 1970s from Just Rye Harbor, and I will show you this lovely picture here right up front, and our herbal bookmark. So the caption on the picture is Wyden and reporter Keegan on lobster trip in the 1970s. So shall we begin? Let's. In March 1973, reporter Buck Howe wrote about the problems of New Hampshire lobstermen. Rye Harbor's Robert Stetson Jr. said that he was going to stop lobstering completely during the summer months and concentrate on drag fishing for his livelihood. There are just too many part-time lobster fishermen during the summer. The lobster buoys get so thick inshore you can't take a boat through them for fear of getting hung up. Stetson said that in the winter, part-time lobstermen were not a problem, but that in the cold, danger and lack of lobsters were a hindrance. In the summer of 1973, there were up to 50 boats leaving Rye Harbor for lobster. That winter, there were 7. Stetson reflected that it takes a lobster 7 years to attain legal size when left to its natural environment. One lobsterman he knew quit lobstering partially because he slipped on an icy dock one day and came within inches of falling overboard into water so cold that he would have been unable to survive even if pulled back aboard. In the interview, Stetson made light of the danger. I could find my way back to Rye Harbor in fog so thick you couldn't see the bow of my boat. He did admit that he had occasionally been caught in a sudden storm, with the usual 2-hour trip back to Rye Harbor taking 4 or 5 hours. Until the 1970s, all of New Hampshire's lobster catch was from inshore waters, those within a mile of the coast. In 1973, Stetson decided to experiment with offshore lobstering. The future for lobstering is in the waters beyond the Isles of Shoals, he said. We're fishing both inshore and offshore. I've got about 70 traps offshore, about 6 miles southeast of the Isles of Shoals in 50 or 60 fathoms of water, and 150 traps inshore. As the winter progresses, I've been bringing in less and less from the offshore traps. Stetson set his inshore traps once a week, and, weather permitting, his offshore traps every 4 days. Last time out, we brought in 120 pounds from the inshore traps and only 16 lobsters from the offshore traps. During a storm, a trap has been known to drift up to 15 miles from its original location. He reported that in fall 1973, his offshore catch was good, with half of his catch selects, more than a pound and a half, and another 25% quarters, pound and a quarter lobsters. Another newspaper article written a year later, in 1974, details young reporter Mary Keegan's voyage with veteran lobsterman John Wyden, a photo that I showed. We reprint the entire article below with permission. John warned me, dress warm. It was a cold sunrise when I reached the dock, dressed down in long johns, corduroy pants, sweaters, wool cap, down jacket, LL Bean hunting boots, woolen cap, and bulky police mittens. John said, the wind picks up after sunrise. John Wyden, 58, is a lobsterman and the harbor master in Rye. He's been fishing for 32 years. John hauled his dinghy up to the shore. We motored out to his boat, the Andrew J., named after his son, another lobsterman. The harbor was quiet. On shore, one man was braiding his traps. Others fished off the dock. Aboard the Andrew J., John handed me a yellow rubber apron. It's a little short. My grandson usually wears it, but it'll do, he said. He told me I could clean the buoys. Lobsters move to deeper sea in the winter, so fishing is done 4 or 5 miles offshore. As we headed out to sea at 30 miles per hour, the salt water splashed over the low sides, soaking through my pants in the space between the too short apron and my boots. John neither capped his ears nor wore gloves. He flung the cabin window above the steering wheel open, letting the wind and spray cover his face. By the time we reached the first string of 10 traps, the wind was blasting through my hat and mittens. I was standing in an inch of frigid water which had come over the sides. John turned the boat upwind, letting the rear sail hold it in position. We were just south of the Isles of Shoals. John captured the buoy with a long hook, tossed the rope over a pulley, circled it around the motor, operated winch 3 times, and tossed the buoy down to me. My heavy-duty mittens were awkward as I scrubbed the slimy brown algae off the styrofoam buoy with the plastic hairbrush. The trap came up from 120 feet below, not brimming with lobsters, covered with seaweed, or filled with eels, as I expected. It contained a few small lobsters and a lone hermit crab. The bait in the trap was completely eaten. The redfish had become a bony, flaking white mass filled with maggot-like sea fleas. John said the sea fleas eat most of the bait. On the deck to our left was the fresh bait, two 250-pound barrels of foul-smelling redfish. The stench from the open barrels blotted out the sea air. John said the help usually baits the traps. I was afraid I'd vomit. 20 traps and 10 lobsters later, I considered begging him to take me back, calling the Coast Guard, or swimming back to shore. John encouraged me, saying, "Those mittens will warm up after they get soaked." I warmed my feet by sticking them near the engine and jostling around as much as possible. John was oblivious to the cold. After all, according to him, it's a warm day. He couldn't even smell the fish on his hands. The haul was disappointing. John blamed it on the swells, exciting the sea fleas who devour the bait. The traps had been set 3 days before, as John only goes out 2 days a week in the winter. "The catch has been getting smaller every year," he said. John got 1/2 of what he expected from his 100 traps, about 50 pounds of lobster. Most of the lobsters caught were too small. Lobsters have to measure 3 1/8 inches from the eye socket to the end of the thorax. We talked of Nixon, an energy crisis, snowmobiles, and the oil refinery. We took long, pensive gazes at the horizon, watching other lobstermen check their traps. John said, "It's a good life." A few gulls swam around the boat looking for food. "Gulls are really sensitive. They usually come right on board," said John, "but they sense your presence, so they won't come too near." John's navigational equipment is uncomplicated, a compass and a two-way radio. Innovations in the lobster business are minimal. However, nylon ropes now last the lifetime of the trap. The styrofoam buoys don't destroy the propeller if the boat goes over one or get waterlogged like wood ones. John had me pegging lobsters as he guided the boat to the next string. By lunchtime, we had hauled in 90 traps. He turned off the motor and we washed our hands in salt water. Lunch and the warm noon sun made me feel better. We talked of mainland things like mountains and old dirt roads. After lunch, John decided to change the location of the last string of traps. We hauled all 10 traps on board. I managed to lift one of the 80-pound traps. At that point, I was warm enough to do anything, even bait the traps. John let me steer the boat back to shore. When I glanced at him over my shoulder, he was gazing intently at the mainland. "It looks real clear when you're coming in," he said. I agreed. It did look inviting. At the dock, John presented me with 5 lobsters, saying, "I needed someone to clean those buoys." As I drove home, redfish permeated the whole car. My eyes seemed to be covered with a film of the fish oil that attracts the lobsters. My face was windburned, my pants soaked, and the brown algae had turned tamale green on my coat and boots. That's the end of that chapter. Let's look at chapter 18 here. Chapter 18 is a bit longer here. We won't get through this one. I can make a start. I guess I could do a few pages of chapter 18, and it may get repeated next week. Chapter 18, Rye Harbor's extraordinary fisherman, Lloyd Hughes. Lloyd Hughes believes he is the oldest fisherman currently working out of Rye Harbor. He was tape recorded in an interview with a Strawberry Bank representative in 1999 at his home in Rye. Hughes grew up in nearby Greenland, New Hampshire. His father worked at the Navy Yard in Portsmouth and continued his labors at home as a part-time dairy farmer. Young Lloyd learned soft-shell clamming from his grandmother, with whom he dug on the flats of Great Bay. There were no clamming regulations of any kind back then as to size or quantity. The pair would also do oystering, just picking them up, walking around with a bushel basket. No digging was required. His mother would then walk the railroad tracks from Tide Mill Road to Sandy Point in Stratham, hiding the clams in bushes so she didn't have to carry them all the way back. An uncle would later carry them home and the family would steal them. Hughes related proudly that kids in those days helped support the family. Picking blueberries in summer, there were blueberries everywhere, and wild cranberries in fall. Rye had a cranberry bog. He noted that all the kids in grammar school had 22s and went rabbit and squirrel hunting. There was no TV then. All entertainment was found outside. Hughes was very careful to make this point on the tape. We didn't shoot each other like they do today. During the war, he worked at the Navy Yard for 6 months as an electrician's helper, but did not find the work active enough. Shortly after graduating from high school in 1946, he bought a rowboat and began fishing as a job at Hampton Beach. He started lobstering with 25 traps. In those days, 100 traps was a lot, hauling them in by hand. As of 1999, he was fishing 70 traps. He has had a mooring at Rye Harbor since 1946. Hughes said that before then there was little room for moorings. Before the breakwater was built, there was no amount of water in the harbor. A fisherman had to drive in through the stone walls with the water 50 yards from shore. Everything was mud and an awful mess. You couldn't put a skiff near enough to shore to unload. People in those early days would put lobster traps in their backyards, sort of looked like a fence. One man had 1,000 traps in his backyard, which his neighbors hated. Today, people keep the traps in the woods out of sight. He finally bought a bigger boat in Kittery, a 20-footer with an inboard motor. Outboards had not really been developed at that time and never worked properly. Inboards had car engines in them, and Hughes was proud to have a Cadillac engine in one of his boats. With his 24-footer, he had 100 traps, but in those days, a fisherman only got one lobster a trap. Today, you get 2 or 3 per trap. Most of his traps were 1 mile out, but today in winter, he has traps up to 16 miles out at the Isles of Shoals. Hughes sold at retail with Saunders Restaurant, using him for many years. When he started, lobsters were going for 30 cents a pound. When the price went down to 25 cents, they all stopped lobstering and just waited until the price went up again. Hughes said that lobstering began to decline after the peak year of 1958, the year he caught 42,000 pounds of lobster and sold it at a good price. Lloyd Hughes married his wife Hazel in 1950, and they raised 4 blonde daughters, Sandra, Cynthia, Deborah, and Lisa. They lived near Rye Harbor, and the girls often used to go to the dock to meet their father when he returned from his trips to sea. I'll show you a picture here. Lloyd Hughes with his favorite catch. As a break from lobstering, he tried shrimping in the late 1960s. He was practically the only shrimper in the area, but there was no market for shrimp. One had to sell to peddlers on the side of the road. He got discouraged with shrimping after a few years because nets on the bottom also caught a lot of small haddock and flounder. I got tired of the waste involved. Then other boats started to dredge for shrimp. These were big boats, and no one had radar, making shrimping scary on foggy days 12 miles out to sea. In 1969, publisher and photographer Peter Randall wrote about Hughes for New Hampshire Profiles magazine, describing Lloyd as one of the few small boat fishermen who fishes in all seasons. 5 winters ago, while lobstering 10 miles beyond the Isles of Shoals, Hughes pulled a trap which was filled with native shrimp, and he reasoned that if that many remained in a slat-sided lobster trap, there must be millions on the bottom. Remembering that Maine fishermen had been successful dragging for shrimp in large boats, Hughes decided to try it for one winter, in a boat heated by a tiny stove and the engine exhaust pipe. Randall writes, his success was immediate. He discovered a basin area 20 miles out from Rye Harbor. Here the spawning shrimp congregate in the mid-ocean pond. The ocean floor was smooth with few obstacles to snag the net and with a recording fathometer to chart the bottom, plus marker buoys for bearings. Hughes was in business. 4 years later, he is still the only New Hampshire shrimp fisherman, despite an average daily catch of 50 to 60 bushels at $8 each. The reason is simple. The working conditions are not for the squeamish, and despite the high returns, the effort is immense. During the December to March shrimp season, the North Atlantic is most inhospitable. Even during good weather, seas run high, the wind is strong, and temperatures hover below freezing. The weather changes quickly, and it takes Hughes' 40-foot diesel-powered boat 2 hours to cover the 20 miles from fishing grounds to Rye Harbor. The conditions are amplified greatly when the sturdy boat rides low in the water with a load of shrimp. Unless the weather is obviously bad, Hughes leaves Rye Harbor at about 5:30 a.m., waiting until the sun begins to rise. After monitoring the marine weather broadcast at 6:20, he decides whether or not to continue on to the basin. Often he turns back, and on more than one occasion, a favorable forecast has been wrong, and a storm has hit while he was fishing. The dragging operation requires 3 men, and Hughes is usually assisted by Bob Stetson, who gave up dairy farming for lobstering, and Dave Ozer, whose penchant for predicaments provides good-natured levity among the men. They work on a share of the catch basis, and despite the high daily income, there are many days at a stretch when the weather cancels a trip. When dragging, 2 doors with 220 pounds of lead on each keep the mouth of the funnel-shaped net open. A chain holds the net on the bottom and floats lift the top. Cables 3 times the depth of the 60-fathom deep basin attach the net to the ship. Writes Randall. A single drag lasts about an hour and yields 10 to 20 bushels of shrimp, plus assorted flounder, haddock, cod, and junkfish. Hughes usually tries to get 60 or more bushels and often accomplishes this in 3 drags, which means a shorter working day. Usually, however, 4 or 5 drags are required, and it is dark when the men return to the harbor. If buyers are not waiting on the dock, Hughes brings the bushels home and calls his customers. Usually, he has orders for all he can catch. Near the end of March, the shrimp finish spawning, and, like so many ocean dwellers, leave the basin for unknown waters. We're turning to talk of lobsters. Hughes believes that you can catch more lobsters in fall when they come in to shed. They also come close to shore in June and July to shed, but he says that when you catch them between February and July, they are hard as rocks. Hughes believes that lobsters today have increased because fishermen today throw the old bait back into the water. In 1999, he reported that they had the biggest year ever, even though biologists in 1998 claims the lobsters were nearly gone. Hughes estimates that fishermen catch 90% of all of the sellable lobsters sitting out there each year and essentially just wait on the rest until the next year when they get big enough to catch. Seals eat lobsters, as do cod. He says they have cleaned up the cod and lobsters are now more plentiful. Soft-shelled lobsters hide in rocks in summertime to shed hard shells. Hughes recalls that 20 years ago he caught a lobster that was half red and half green, divided that way right down the middle. But a giant lobster ate him. That was the end of that tall tale. In fall 2003, he caught a brownish mini seahorse in a trap, which he brought to the Seacoast Science Center at Odeon Point State Park. Lloyd Hughes now lobsters until November 1st. Sometimes when someone says to him, "It's a slow day," he looks back and says, "Are you kidding? For years, there would only be 2 cars in the entire parking lot." Here's Lloyd Hughes and his crew battling a large tuna. And then Lloyd Hughes with a large tuna. I don't know if this is the same one. They were successful or if it's a different one. So next time we will get into the tuna fishing and continue with the chapter 18 on Lloyd Hughes. Have a great night, everyone.